This is God's holy word.
I was sitting in my home office, okay, so it's our guest bedroom, participating in a Zoom meeting several months ago, and I heard the pecking begin. That loud, fast pecking. It was so loud, in fact, that my colleagues could hear it through their computers, which meant that pecking had to go through the wall of my house and then all the way through the entire World Wide Web. This was a level 5 woodpecker situation. So I thought I turned off my camera and I muted my microphone so I could lean forward and pound on that wall to fend off the attacks of this creature trying to make a home in our siding. But I forgot to do those first two things. So the people on the other end of the call got quite an earful from me, and I sounded less than welcoming and compassionate. I don't love woodpeckers. When I was in college at Denison University, I would watch the buzzards fly high above the campus hill, soaring with their wings expanded. If you have been to Denison before, then maybe you know that there's this particular air pocket above the hill that is prime soaring conditions for these massive buzzards, and it's an impressive sight to watch, except for the time that one of them decided to come swooping down about 3 feet in front of me on the quad. It was unexpected. He gave me no warning. I was convinced I was being attacked, so I did something ridiculous like this, and I stumbled backward on a quad in front of my peers. I don't love buzzards. It all goes back to when I was maybe 5 years old and I couldn't sleep one night, so I went to go find my parents. They were up late watching a movie in our family room, sitting on a couch that was oriented with its back toward you as you walk into the room. So I thought, I can just stand right behind them and watch a little bit of this movie, and they'll never know that I'm up this late. But the image on the TV quickly became disturbing as thousands of birds swarmed a character. My parents were watching, and some of you have already guessed it, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, a movie not at all appropriate for 5-year-olds, or those of us older than 5. And I happened to walk in during the most horrifying scene. I may have been scarred for life because, as you've deduced, I don't love birds. But you know what? I have come to learn that God made this world, or at least church, for the birds. So maybe I'm coming around to our feathered friends after all. The gospel writer Mark's audience was probably more sympathetic to birds than I am. In fact, they were accustomed to tales with agricultural references that sounded a lot like their life and their work. And birds are an essential part of the agricultural circle of life, picking up seeds and carrying them from here to there. Mark shared with his audience 4 consecutive parables with agricultural imagery, and they're called the parables of the kingdom, or as I like to call them for our day and age, parables of the kingdom. Each one a lesson about how a kingdom, a world community developed in a partnership between God and people, comes to fruition. Matthew and Luke offer similar versions of the same lessons in their gospel texts too. And the parable of the mustard seed is my favorite parable in the entire Bible. Mark places these parables after a couple of very important moments in his story of Jesus' ministry. One of those moments is when Jesus goes up a mountaintop and calls his friends to gather with him, and he appoints them as his 12 disciples. Immediately thereafter, in Mark's telling, is when Jesus is now home from the mountaintop, and an angry crowd gathers outside his house to accuse him of being out of his mind. Those are the words that Mark uses. out of his mind. So in Mark's timeline, it goes like this. Jesus appoints his disciples, this group of friends who love him, who trust him, who have faith in him. And then immediately thereafter, there comes a group of people shouting accusations that Jesus is being controlled by demons. Two groups of people Mark has placed in essentially the same time and location. He is drawing our attention to the discord in their community. It sure feels like a good time to teach a lesson about kinship and kingdom, doesn't it? So Jesus says to them in Mark chapter 3, if a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, the house will not be able to stand. Shortly thereafter, Jesus goes to the seaside to teach a crowd we can assume is still divided, full of skeptics and believers, you name it. This is where he furthers his point with the parables of the kingdom. The parable of the mustard seed is my favorite because it's a lesson about looking at something small that might first appear hopeless. What could this possibly become? Recognizing it instead for its potential. There's abundance inside. I also love this parable because it makes me think of my late grandmother. She was my maternal grandma, lovingly known as Grandma Dell. Grandma Dell lived in Garden City, New York, in a lovely but modest home, and she appreciated some of the finer things in life. She dressed impeccably, she loved to entertain, and she enjoyed going to church on Sundays. Grandma Dell was also a fiercely honest woman, never keeping her opinions too quiet. So it was no secret to our family that she went to church not because of any deep faith, but it's because this is where her friends were on Sunday. She enjoyed the music, she jumped at the chance to dress up, but she admitted she wasn't quite buying the preacher's message. I think my Grandma Dell was so intellectual and so academic. The idea of a God she couldn't see or hear or feel or rationalize was just too hard for her to accept. But she just kept going to church, white gloves and all. When I was in high school and really involved in my own church and becoming more interested in matters of faith and religion, I asked my mom, does it bother you that your own mom doesn't fully believe in God? And my mom said, no, not at all. She keeps showing up at that church of hers, which tells me there's a mustard seed of faith in there somewhere. And that's all it really takes. I didn't really understand it at the time, but it started to make sense to me a few years later. You see, I lived with my grandma for part of a summer during college. I had an internship in Manhattan, which sounds much swankier than it actually was. I'll tell you that story on another day. So I would take the Long Island Railroad into the city each morning, and I would come home to my sweet Gram every night. Those several weeks turned out to be cherished time for us to grow closer. She loved reminiscing about her own professional days when she worked for a Republican state senator. She was so proud of that. And she would tell me all about the book that she had read cover to cover that very day while I was at work. And when the moment felt right one evening, I asked her about her church and why she kept going if she didn't necessarily believe any of it. And it turns out, brutally honest Grandma Dell had a few gripes about her church, and she didn't mind sharing them at all. You see, the church started out Episcopalian, and then it became a community congregational church, and then it became a United Church of Christ. To quote my grandmother, that just sounds too Jesus-y to me. And then, sounding a bit more tired, she said, and there's just been so much change. There had been arguments, anger, hurt with each transition of that church. So why did she keep going? She began to tell me about the people in her congregation, the people who had become my Gram's dear friends, and about their mission work, all the organizations her church supported in the community and in the world, including those that were seeking to educate young girls. Despite all the changes and the things that irritated her, and despite her disbelief, this was her place to go on Sundays, to get a bit recharged with people she loved, doing mission work she believed in. In our gospel text today, Jesus tells his friends and those who don't quite trust him the following. When the mustard seed is sown upon the ground, it is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. And when it is sown in, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all the shrubs and puts forth large branches so the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. Think again about the birds of the sky and the miles they must fly when they're not trying to break into my house or dive bomb kids on a college campus. Birds require a place to take refuge, to rest, to lean on the everlasting arms of a safe tree or, yes, a mustard bush. When I think back to my conversation with my Grandma Dell, I realize she may not have been ready to sow a seed. But I hear her saying, "Church is my place to nest each week." I know my mom referenced the mustard seed of faith in my gram, and yes, many individuals grow our faith from just a tiny seed-sized portion of belief. But let us recognize that entire communities sometimes start there too. Like a community of thousands in a region of ancient Jerusalem where the growth began with just 13 people. Or a community in Garden City, New York that had experienced tumultuous changes in identity, but it kept growing and serving the world anyway. And it provided refuge to one stubborn, honest, very well-dressed woman, her doubts and all. And perhaps faith communities that weather other storms like global pandemics, staff transitions, congregational votes, might feel like they are re-emerging, growing from some place that feels very small and maybe even a little fragile. And that's okay. It's okay if we're wary. It's okay if we have a bit of doubt. Doubt is not the absence of faith. It is faith with room to grow. Speaking of growing, Mark uses a verb to describe how the mustard seed grows up. And it's the same Greek verb he used to describe Jesus ascending the mountain to appoint his 12 disciples. He wrote in a form of Greek that was simple enough for a wide audience to understand. So his choice to use that same word in stories he chose to put this close together provides a connection his audience would have picked up on. Growing in community for the purpose of nurturing others is the same kind of holy experience as drawing nearer to God. So how do we get there? How do we collaborate with each other and co-create with God to grow into a fruitful, safe haven kind of kingdom? Let us start with that seed, that little ounce of faith. It's not just our faith in God in matters, but in a kingdom, it's our faith in each other too. Let's acknowledge God's abundance in our relationships to each other instead of worrying there's scarcity in what we have in common. Most churches and organizations have spent the last 14 months rethinking how to do things. We want to gather around Christ's table to partake in Holy Communion. How do we do that and keep each other safe and healthy? Rituals are important. We want to have potlucks and softball games and give each other hugs in a busy narthex on Sunday mornings. Traditions like that are what make a community special. So we've found ourselves missing those rituals and traditions or adapting them, sometimes awkwardly. And as we begin to come to the other side of this pandemic prayerfully, what will this kingdom look like? I recently came to learn about an author named Tanya Markle. She has had quite a journey of her own. She writes about going through deep struggles of personal and family addiction, mistreatment at the hands of people she loved, a battle of self-loathing. And now, after much healing, she's growing into a brave storyteller, ready to express her pain and her healing to help others find that same kind of healing. She knows something about growing from a place of uncertainty, and she writes this: be patient when becoming someone you haven't been before. I think those of us in faith communities can take a note from Tanya Markle. Offer ourselves and each other some grace. Be patient when becoming a congregation we haven't been before. So we have our abundant mustard seed, and we're equipped with grace, so what next? Jesus tells those gathered around him about the transforming power of the earth. The seed is sown into the ground before it can sprout up. And we know this. Westerville Community United Church of Christ is fertile ground. The soil here is rich with love and history and hand-holding benedictions before holding hands was dangerous. The holy promise in this lesson is that our ability to grow in fellowship with each other and with God, to care for this world, is abundant, no matter how small our start or our restart. And that's good news indeed, especially for those of you who aren't quite sure if you're buying anything this preacher is saying. Because I am faithful this church will give you a place to nest. Amen.